Hi, this is Amruth, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about magic and magical practices through history. So, this presentation is going to be sectioned off into 4 parts, each focusing on a different time period and civilization in history and the specific magical artifacts, texts, and practices used in that time period. And it's going to be first focusing on ancient Mesopotamia, then moving on to ancient Egypt, and moving on then to the Greco-Roman world and the Hellenistic system, and finally finishing with the view of magic in the Middle Ages in Europe, and also including a small section at the end on how that had an impact on today's world and how there are still evolving views today around magic. So, I'm going to be talking about magic as more than entertainment, really. I'm going to show how humanity has understood, practiced, and integrated these practices throughout history and how culture and environment has fostered or not fostered that. So, for this presentation, my guiding question was, why have humans always been so fascinated with magic? And this doesn't even always have to be a positive fascination. Of course, with some of the time periods I'm going to be talking about, like a lot of like Mesopotamia, Egypt, in a lot of those time periods, magic was thought of as good, as thought of as like something used to help and to heal, and in that way humans were fascinated with it. But fascination could also be something like in the Middle Ages, how with like the rise of Christianity, like a lot of people were condemning magic, and that environment was sort of really obsessed with or fascinated with making sure that magic wasn't practiced. So that's my question, and I'm going to be answering it throughout this presentation. So, firstly, I'd like to define what magic is, what I mean by this word. So, to define what magic is, you need to first understand that magic, or each civilization and sort of group throughout the history of the world, regardless of how civilized or developed that group is, they have some knowledge for practical activities. And maybe that's like fishing, hunting, etc. But they have some knowledge for practical activities that are necessary for them to thrive and exist as a group or civilization. But inevitably, they will encounter gaps in that knowledge, especially in the ancient world where science was obviously not as developed. And you would encounter gaps in that knowledge and wouldn't be able to explain a lot of the natural things that were natural phenomenon that were going on at the time. And that could be like maybe illness or storm, natural disaster. There is a point where that goes beyond the knowledge for the practical activities you have, and it's sort of like an unexplainable aspect, and that's where magic really comes from. A good way of phrasing it is like magic comes from the tragedies of human life. It's like the conflict between human plans of what we're going to do to achieve this goal and prosper as a civilization versus realities, which could be natural causes like illness, poverty, drought, etc. And that magic was used sort of to bridge this gap. And that also means that magic was never used when basic science, basic skill could provide control, which kind of differs from the definition of magic a lot of people today might have, especially influenced by like film and literature representations of magic. And those like show people doing simple tasks like moving things and making things levitate. But For me, magic is not really that. That's not really why magic was invented. Not really to like do things in a way that didn't require human input or do things in a more efficient way. It was done so it could bridge this gap of like unexplainable. It's coming from this deeply human desire to explain even the unexplainable, even if that means not having enough data or not having observable data to support that as they do with science. And that's also why I would argue that even though a lot of people and a lot of scholars talk about magic as like a pseudoscience, pre-science, like a foundation for the sciences that were driven by repeatable observation, I would argue that it's not really that. Magic and magical practices is the complete opposite. It's recognition of science's limitations. The little science they had at the time, it couldn't explain these uncontrollable natural phenomenon that was going on, and magic and you blaming that on sort of like an overarching evil force like the devil or ghost, that was like a natural point, a natural stepping stone, natural next point for a lot of people in that. And magic also that has deep links with religion, and that like thought and that like idea of having to bridge that unexplainable gap is also where a lot of religion and early forms of religion really come from. An example of this would be the concept of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism as it's translated a lot, and that was sort of a base for a lot of like the Jewish practices today, where even like talking about that, the terms and connotations can vary across cultures and periods. Magic doesn't always have to mean this thing that like goes above science and is like used when science has limitations. In a lot of contexts, especially non-Western contexts, it's definitely not. An example would be Islamic sir, which sir is often translated similarly to magic in a lot of texts, and this concept does include a lot of things Westerners would categorize as magic, especially like evil magic, but it also includes practices like gossip and other arts of deception, which are considered sinful. And this word was kind of used to talk about sinful things, but like gossip and arts of deception, even though they're thought of like magic as and like impure or sinful, they don't seem very sinful from a Western perspective. So it really highlights how like culture shapes the definition of these words and how different cultures really foster different magical practices. And because of that, magical practices also seem to mirror religion in a lot of ways. And it's sort of like even intertwined with religion. And I'll be talking about this later on, but especially towards like the end of the medieval era, there were a lot of challenges to separate unorthodox magic, like evil, witchcraft, sorcery, with like legitimate religion. Because even in religion, a lot of these things and a lot of these concepts that you would, in a Western context, categorize under a magic are things that are thought of as pious or like relating to actual legitimate religion, which goes back to show that point of how magic can have such a different definition depending on the context and time period. Another example of this would be Tibetan Buddhists, who had rituals designed to conjure and restore fortune. And that is very obviously against Western beliefs of magic and would obviously be condemned in a lot of Western societies and contexts, but that is also a legitimate legitimate religious practice in their religious framework. So again, that's a bit of a big ambiguous, that word magic. So going to start this study of magic and magical practices by talking about ancient Mesopotamia. So ancient Mesopotamia is, I'm talking about like the first century BCE, first millennia. That's where magic really took off for all the reasons I've talked about and discussed before. So in ancient Mesopotamia, magic was like almost integral to daily life. Things like medicine and cosmology were almost were used very widely, and a lot of magical practices then were also similar to what we might call like first like medicine or things rooted in science. So that was almost like the base for the civilization. It was such an integral part of daily life, and it even like predated fixed religion and these like incantations and like specific totems that they use. Those were sort of like a base for their religion, but a lot of this predated religion, and it was one of the first ways to sort of interpret and shape reality, which was again like a bridge for that gap in knowledge. So that desire also led further on into a more structured form of magic and a more structured magical roles in society, with specific magic practitioners. Some of the most common in ancient Mesopotamia were Ashipu, Asu, and Baru. Ashipu were ritual specialists. They were also advisors to the king, and they would use like incantations, divination, sort of to diagnose supernatural threats, especially to royalty. A lot of these magical practitioners were in league with the king and royalty, and were doing magic to like help the monarchy, which is one of the main differences between like dark magic and white magic and magic that was acceptable and not, as I'll talk about later. And Shipu, they mainly used incantations to ward off misfortune that they detected or purify people that had committed sin. And when they did this, there were a few specific texts that were used very frequently in these practices. The first being the Maklu series, which is around witchcraft and evil magic, and it's a way of like repelling that. And the second being the Supa series, which is purification. So that's for anyone that has like committed a sin to sort of Surapu. Actually, like it translates to burning, so it's sort of burning away that sin. And they had these specific objects that they would use, like the Maklu incantation tablets and many other clay tablets, as sort of mediums to do this magic. And here you can actually see one of the incantation tablets. This is a Maklu, or anti-witchcraft tablet. It's clay, and it's been inscribed on with different incantations that they would have sort of read aloud, probably paired it with different forms of magic to sort of to like repel witchcraft. The second magical practitioner that I'll be talking about are Asu. And Asu are physicians. They were considered physicians in their time. And they treated ailments, and they were almost like early doctors. And they used a lot of the natural world. They used like herbs and plants and minerals to create like different like elixirs to feed to the sick to help them. And yeah, though that was considered magic at the time, it could be almost considered in today's world as like medicine or just like natural remedies, very rooted in science, not at all as like mystical or magical as it would have been at that time, which again shows the change of like the definition of magic through time. And those also mostly use like natural substances as ailments for the sick. They also collaborated and supplemented that with actual magic or like incantations, and they collaborated with the Ashipu to not only heal the body with herbs, but use like these magical incantations to get rid of evil and burn away sin, and used a combination of both because they were both thought of equally in the same field and as equals. So they used a combination of both, a lot of different magical practices to really combat this unexplainable natural occurrence, which was like illness. The third I'd like to talk about are baru, which are diviners, and they interpreted divine signs in the natural and social world. And they mostly did this through a process called ecstaspy, and that is reading the entrails or the organs of sacrificed animals. They would like cut open animals and like look at their organs, and they would use that with the knowledge they had to sort of interpret what they looked like, and they used that to give advice on war, agriculture, and royal decisions, especially for royalty. And that was sort of a way of like predicting the future, so the royalty could be prepared for the misfortunes that are going to happen. And again, this did have a lot of different texts and artifacts that were used by these practitioners to do these practices, especially ecstaspy. Text-wise, one of the most popular was the Barutu, two meaning book, and that's a divination handbook. It was consulted very widely by Baru, and artifacts-wise, mostly liver models were used, especially for reading animal liver and entrails. They would have a liver model similar to one that's on the slide right now, and these would mostly be made with clay or bronze, and they have specific shapes, specific carvings and markings and text that can actually help them determine what animal's liver means and what it means if it looks like something or if it doesn't look like something. And this is called Haruspex, this liver model. Yeah. And that's sperm. And going back, I'd like to also answer the question, why was magic so popular at that time? And why were all these practitioners so dedicated to their crafts? And what was the goal of magic? So, magic was created mostly to combat supernatural threats from demons and ghosts, as they, in the Mesopotamian era, would really refer to them as. And that was any like natural disasters or negative occurrences that are unexplainable that would happen. Demons and ghosts, or like higher powers beyond the science that they knew, were what they really blamed it on. And magic was also like beyond the science, so like combat stuff that's beyond the science with evil forces beyond the sciences. And they thought they were responsible for natural disasters, and that's why all these systems and all this all these magical practices really came about. And especially for demons and ghosts, many artifacts were also created, and those included incantation bowls, clay figures, amulets. Incantation bowls, like the one pictured on the sides, were actually kept on graveyards and specific places where demons and ghosts were believed to lurk, face down on the ground, so it would suck up and trap these ghosts and demons and evil forces to sort of shield the civilizations from these natural disasters. And clay figures and amulets, they would often take the form of like specific magical shapes, or even like gods, and they were kept for like personal safety and personal safety against like demons and ghosts. And that was really when through these natural occurrences that always happened and it couldn't be explained, that's when witchcraft or like evil magic really started coming to the attention of these civilizations, long before like even the witch trials or Christianity's influence on witchcraft. Like evil sorcery was always something that was in the minds of people historically, and this was very strongly distinguished from white magic, which is all the magic I've talked about before, about like Asu, Baru, and all the other like good magical practitioners that were practicing to improve on something. And witchcraft was in that time very condemned, and it was almost like punishable by death in those times. And a lot of the times they just really needed someone to blame in these unexplainable natural disasters. So a lot of people, especially like outcasts or people that didn't really follow with the civilization's rules and norms, are like the ones targeted. They were targeted through one of the first legal documents written, called the Code of Hammurabi. It has one of the earliest legal codes, like I said, containing info regarding evil witchcraft, and that focuses around some basic rules. If someone accuses another person of unprovable witchcraft, the accuser is executed, and if evil sorcery was proven, the accuser faced death. And here on the slide is a picture of that Code of Hammurabi. As you can see, it's not really written as a book, or like what you would think of as a book. It was actually this huge sculpture, and there were actually laws and codes like inscribed on the exterior. I don't know if it's visible, but that's what this legal code really was. And yeah, that really goes to show how evil sorcery and witchcraft have always been in the minds of people, and have always been surprisingly like a logical explanation for all these negative natural disasters, which like makes sense. Yeah. So how and why were people convicted of evil witchcraft? So I talked about this a little before, but generally like outcasts or people that didn't follow with social norms. But the reason why, especially in this era, people that were working for royalty, or the diviners, the healers, the magical practitioners that I talked about before, why they were treated well and they weren't really convicted of anything and that was normalized, is because they were working for royalty mostly, and they were working for like royal decisions and like war and threats to the king. And royalty in that time was thought of as almost like divinity. They were thought of as like almost chosen by gods at that time. And working for like divinity or like a higher power was something that was very good, because you were well, the main concern with magic is because it overrules that higher power. But since they were working for that higher power and they were working in league with the highest power in that civilization, it was thought of as okay, and it was thought of as like normalized. Whereas people that were working with like folk magic, doing divination for their personal gain, were thought of more as like trying to overrule this like source of power, or a source of like almost divinity and royalty. So they were probably the ones convicted of evil witchcraft, because they were trying to go above the highest power, and they were being selfish and doing magic for themselves. Okay. So, going back to the beginning, I talked a little bit about why magic is, which was summarized because of a gap in practical knowledge and an unexplainable natural occurrences, and magic would have been something that went beyond the basic science to sort of explain this unbridgeable gap. And many of these rituals that I talked about in ancient Mesopotamia, they did come about when civilizations and their basic science encountered an unbridgeable gap. And that can be illness, natural disaster, and unexplained misfortune. And that's often attributed to demons and ghosts, since it can't be explained with science. It must be something that transcends science. So this is such a, in my opinion, like a uniquely human instinct to explain everything and control the negative, even though that didn't really make sense. It wasn't really rooted in observation or anything. It was sort of just made up. Magical practices were made up, but that just goes to show how strong that human instinct is to just ask why is that and how to explain everything. That's why humanity has gone so far. And because of that, that's also sort of led to religion, like these higher powers above science, and that idea of like beyond explainable observation led to like the concept of gods. And especially in a lot of different civilization, there were gods for specific elements. And as I was saying, talking about the natural world and the unbridgeable gap about like why the natural world was, the gods that were about gods of these natural elements in the natural world, that really relates to one another. The humans were really just trying to figure out how to explain this thing, this nature, that couldn't really be interpreted at that point. So that's where really religion as a concept came from. Next, I'll be talking about magical practices in ancient Egypt. So we're skipping a few centuries now and going into Egypt. So magic in Egypt is slightly different from what I just talked about, Mesopotamian magic, due to just cultural differences. But magic around in Egypt, it almost evolved, or it evolved around the system governed by Heka. And Heka was a Egyptian god, the god of magic. He's not very referred to in a lot of Egyptian texts or historical artifacts because he was thought of less as a god like the other gods and more of like a personification of magic, this force and this like the entirety of magic as a whole. And Heka and that personification of magic, that force, was sort of created to minimize dark forces and maintain a concept they had called Ma'at, which is sort of peace, or just a world without these dark forces. So, like in a lot of other cultures and civilizations, magic in ancient Egypt used mostly for healing, funerary practices, and protection. Similar to Mesopotamia, it was used when these natural phenomenon would have a negative impact on people, and they used natural phenomenon back for like healing and protecting themselves and protecting their community. So, I would like to talk about a very important Egyptian text or artifact, the Book of Dead, which is a very strong example of what I've been talking about, of like a need to control the natural world, a need to like protect. And a bit about the Book of Dead. It's not exactly a book. Book of Dead is more of a modern term. It's used to describe this collection of around 200 known Egyptian ritual spells, incantations, prayers, and funerary texts. And they were mostly written and created to aid the dead and deceased in their journey through what they would think of as the underworld, what was also called Duat. And that is another prime example of like an unbridgeable gap, something they didn't have knowledge about and what science couldn't explain. What happens after death? And they sort of use the natural world to try to explain that, try to protect themselves in that sense. And the goal of these spells and the goal of the afterlife was ultimately, in their belief, to achieve a successful union with the sun god Ra and the nether god Osiris. Osiris. And yeah, as I was saying before, this wasn't really collected in a book. It was a combination of spells around this like large list of like 200. There could be more Egyptian incantations. There were specific combinations of spells used depending on who the person was, their sort of role in society, maybe like who they were as a person, or like how they were going to get through the netherworld, the underworld, and they were inscribed on various objects on or near the deceased person. So on their coffin, they would be carved in these specific incantations or spells. On the mummy wrappings, combinations of spells would be written. And on funerary figures like shabi and papyrus scrolls, they would write down these different spells to aid them throughout the afterlife. In Egyptian practice, Egyptian funerary practice, there was also a belief that like the soul would decay if the body did. So that's why mummy wrappings were so essential and why maintaining the body was so crucial. And even in that, like ceremonies like the opening of the mouth, which was done with almost every deceased person in Egypt, where a priest touched various magical objects to parts of the deceased, like their eyes, their nose, their mouth, ears, so they could have senses in the afterlife, like sight, touch, smell. It's all such strong examples of this uniquely human need to sort of control things out of human and scientific control. So, also this image that you see on the slide right now, this is also one of the papyrus scrolls I was talking about. This would have been something they would have buried a deceased person with, some incantations, as you can see in hieroglyphics, about from the Book of Dead to help them in the afterlife. They would have rolled this up and put it in their coffin near them or on them to help. So, going back to this concept of Heka, also unique to Egypt and Egyptian magic was the belief in the power of words, creative utterance, as called by historians now. And that's why spells and incantations became really popular, and even like hymns or prayers, that's where they really came from in a lot of cultures. That's why they became so popular, in the belief and the power of words that they had. Also, it was believed that all Egyptians possessed some form of Heka, and in that certain people were more adept. For example, lector priests, like the Asu, for example, that in Mesopotamian magic, they were the educated or like highly dedicated, fluent, influential practitioners of magic. They would have been like the highest role, and they would have not been thought as evil or sinful like a lot of other magic is. They would have been thought as like helpful or like divine almost. And they were responsible for reading and interpreting the ancient sacred books of magic. They were very high status. A lot of other people couldn't really interpret these that are kept in like temple libraries, and they were sort of that high level that could actually read and perform the magic based on this. And that being said, there were lower level magical practitioners in this time, the most notable of which include Kau, which word for general magicians who would have participated in folk magic like divination, maybe a little bit of incantation, but nothing as complex as the lector priests would have, but lower level. And lower than that are scorpion charmers, which don't really go into magic in the sense of incantations or divinations, mostly just people who protect against venomous creatures in like a physical way. They would actually charm these scorpions and snakes and sort of protect people from them. And that also goes to show like the evolving definition of magic depending on the specific civilization. Even though that's not really considered magic, that's just like snake charming. It's rooted in like science. That was considered magic at the time because it went above the science of the time. That's a good way to think about it. Like what the definition of magic is what goes beyond the science of the time period you're in. So and magic force was often put into objects themselves all throughout. And they were also for the first totems of power. And there were a few different forms of magic that were practiced by these people, lector priests or lower level magicians. The first being protective magic. And again, this is another example of protecting the world from misfortune, which was what really magic was created under, to sort of defend the world from these evil sources that, or devils, ghosts, that was what they would really, that would be their logical conclusion to things like drought and other natural disasters. That's what magic was really made for. And higher level magical practitioners would, that was their job, to sort of defend the world against these supernatural misfortunes. That was what Egyptian magic really was all about. And they would create specific rituals for this, very dependent, like incantations and very like objects, talisman, amulets, and that would include things like vigorous stamping, loud shouting, etc. Almost like scare the evil spirits away. And similar to Mesopotamian practices, amulets were also used in these practices, and that could be anything like a totem or like images of God, similar to a lot of the other civilizations I'm going to be talking about. And this is where like magic and specific artifacts that could be held and traded rather than having to do the incantations or practices yourself really came about from the or like protect and like protective magic. A lot of people needed and wanted to be able to protect themselves. So that's where amulets and like specific artifacts emerged. Amulets, especially in ancient Egypt, were sort of, it could mean one of 5 things. The first being scarabs, like the one pictured on the slide. Those are often worn around the neck. They resemble a bug. They resemble an actual scarab, and they represent rebirth and the sun god. And yeah, that's another example of like how they use the images of God and for protection. Second, the unks, which are symbols of life, they would also be carried around or worn around for like good health and longer life. And also another Wujat eyes, which were again an image of God. They were a representation of Horus's eyes, the god Horus, and that was used mostly for good health. And the jet pillars, again another image of God, which was related to the backbone of Osiris. And then lastly, the Taya amulet, which was associated with the goddess Isis, symbolizing protection. So this is where we really see like religion and more widespread magic being sort of a stepping stone to widespread religion really taking off. And relating to that, a lot of protective figures like the lion dwarf god Bes and the goddess Durat similarly were also frequently carved into beds, furniture, and household items to protect the home's inhabitants. So that magic and protection magic was really more widespread after that. So even though I've mostly been talking about magic as a means of protection, as a means of shielding from dark forces, as time went on, people, especially people in specific magically dense civilizations, began to identify it not as just a source of protection or a source of like divination, not just for good or for the good of themselves, the good for the civilization. They began to realize it for what it truly was. If it could do these things, that meant it was an all-powerful source. They were just applying it to only protection. And once magic was really identified as an all-powerful source, as humans do, it began being used for destructive purposes beyond just plain protection. And this was done through a process and a practice called execution texts. And that was used to mostly like inflict harm upon enemies and used in a very harmful way after that was really identified and after magic was thought of as an all-powerful source. And the way it really worked is names of enemies would be written on objects easily breakable or cheap, like clay figurines, and then they would be then smashed or destroyed or just burned or just completely soiled under the belief that destroying a person's name and spirit weakens their physical body. And this demonstrates such a significant shift where magic is really now being used for various purposes and is now being thought of not as a means of protection like it was before, but it's being thought of as an all-powerful source that transcends even science. And that is still sort of echoed even today through a lot of like superstitions and even a lot of magical practices doing today. Next, I'll be focusing on the magical practices in the Greco-Roman world. So that's Greek and Roman mythology, literature, magical practices, and the Hellenistic system. So first, I'd like to define what magic is and what it meant for Greeks and Romans. Very similar to Egyptian and Mesopotamian magic, as I've talked about before, but similarly, it encompassed a wide variety of practices, but uniquely to Greco-Roman or Hellenistic system, that magic, it could sort of be categorized into a few main sections that a lot of magical practices and magical artifacts and texts were created and performed under. The first being spells and incantations, which we encountered many times before in Mesopotamian and Egyptian magic, and those were called epidai. And secondly, cursed tablets. This is another example of like magic being used for evil purposes, not necessarily evil, but nefarious purposes, for weakening their body, being used not just for protection, but used as a really powerful source that they use to hurt their enemies. Cursed tablets that were called katadesmoi. And also, those were actually specifically, they were written on a thin sheet of lead. They were inscribed with curses, typically rolled up, nailed, and buried in specific locations to activate power and disrupt the victim, which is another form of like inflicting harm upon enemies, similar to the ones we encountered in Egyptian magic. Next is drugs and poisons, which were also called pharmaca. And these are interesting because the term could be used for beneficial medicines, like the one we talked about, like asu, and a lot of the practices in Egypt, where they would mix up like minerals and like herbs and other natural substances to make a sort of rudimentary medicine for the sick. But it could also very easily also refer to substances used for evil magic and poison, which is where the nuance comes up. And another bit of magic that was very common and very much more popularized in this era was love potions, philautra. And that was yet another form of sort of interpreting and influencing the natural world, this desire to influence something in like love, which couldn't be really understood by science. They had to go above that and sort of use magic and create love potions to really understand, or like in this case, influence that. Next, Greek and Roman magic was thought of slightly differently from the magic I've been talking about. Social perception changed a bit when discussing these. So, magician, or the word magos in Greek, what they would have used, was initially derived from the word magoi. And that's actually a caste of ancient Persians, and they're respected for their knowledge in astronomy, math, and healing, which roughly represent the magical practices conducted by these people in the Greek and Roman world, and that was mostly like a term of prestige. But as time went on, in Greek and Roman context, the term soon came to mean negative connotations and associated with practitioners with fraud, trickery, or dangerous supernatural power, because, as noted before, it was sort of going above what they thought was intended for humans to be able to do, and it went above what humans should, by their laws, their science, be able to do. So it just felt very unnatural, weird. It was other for them. So that's why a lot of practitioners, especially folk magic practitioners that were practicing for themselves, doing things like divination or charms to help with everyday things, they were not really thought of as highly by society, and they lived often poor on the fringes of society because of that. Magic was, however, thought of and received well when not really at a civilization perspective, but when it's used in divinity. And divinity could also mean royalty because of that connection of a lot of people across history and a lot of civilizations thinking of kings and queens and monarchs as a form of God. So magic was, used and accepted when between divinity, especially in Greco-Roman mythology and literature. There are many famous examples of specific Greek and Roman gods, goddesses, and magic and figures that revolve around magic. Some of which include Hermes, messenger god, Hecate, you might be familiar with, and Orpheus, Circe, who's a sorceress. Hecate, like the ruler of witches, I think. And here pictured is a sculpture of Hecate. This is not really the same thing as the talisman that they would have carried of figures of God and goddesses, but it is like a sculpture of Hecate that was done in the time. So through that, magic's destructive power was also really realized. An example of this story from Greek and Roman mythology, where Hercules, a prominent figure in Greek mythology, died from a magically poisoned cloak given to him by his wife, Dendri. And she mistakenly believed it was a love charm to win back his affection, but it was actually filled with the venomous blood of the centaur Nessus. So this is like one of the first, or not the first, but a realization that magic wasn't always good. And another, we can see the evolution we saw previously of like magic not being thought of purely as the force it was created to like protect and help civilizations prosper, but it was also now being thought of as like an all-powerful source. So that with that also comes more and more negative connotations, and magic being used to harm people and being used for like violent or evil purposes. And we see a lot of magic in Greek mythology, but again, magic is also very widely performed by at state level, especially in royals who were thought of as godly, just not regular citizens. And because of that, the state still tried to actively sought to control and punish what they would think of as harmful magic, which would be people not working for divinity but just doing folk magic on their own. And there were specific laws, again, surrounding this called beneficia in Roman law, and that would mean like harmful magic, and there would be a lot of punishment that would happen for especially people that were still practicing that, as we've seen with previous examples, as it was associated with like the dark magic and things that humans and mortals shouldn't really have access to. So there was a lot of punishment that really was allowed in that time because of like how a lot of these people were outcast, and they were sort of going against what the state thought humans and mortals should be able to do. And because of that, punishments were very severe as they tried to eliminate all these outcasts and have a more like pure section of people free of these outcasts that could be potentially practicing harmful magic, which sort of predates witch hunts or other forms of this, but it's really always been something that humans have been thinking about throughout history. A few notable examples of punishment: 5th century BCE, in the city of Theos, inscription says a man and his family faced execution for practicing harmful magic, which was common in that time. 4th century BCE, Athens, a woman named Theris was also executed for using pharmaca, which, if you remember from the beginning, is medicine, either harmful medicine like poisons or things that could actually be in remedies. And even though this was a remedy, since they were doing it by themselves and not really for a higher level, any magic in that scope was thought of as harmful magic, and execution was needed for that. And it really depends on the context and who is using this thing called magic. And as like a more need for magic and for both protecting and also attacking was more widespread throughout classes, a lot of people really, as I said before, couldn't really actively do these practices and didn't really know how to perform specific magical rituals. So amulets and magical objects that could just simply be worn around the neck or worn close to oneself or in a pocket or in a pouch, those really took off because those could both serve the purpose of magic and also be more widespread. And that's why a lot of different social classes really used these objects, and that's why they were really popular. In the Hellenistic system, which is the system of Greco-Roman magic, two objects in particular were common. The first being something called a talisman, and these are any objects believed to attack good fortune, success, or specific positive outcomes in life. They were just thought to draw in beneficial energies from the earth to the person wearing it. Here, on the top, you see a talisman. They were often worn around the neck, but they could look very different from this. They were just really any object that was believed to have these positive outcomes. And throughout history, they looked very different, varied in actual physical appearance. The second being phylacteries, which are not for good fortune, rather for protection, like I was talking about before. A lot of the times they would be ascribed with divine names, divine forms, maybe even the shape of specific forms of like gods and goddesses and specific figures. They would have maybe even symbols, religious symbols, and they were mostly to ward off evil. So in Greek and Roman, what did this really look like? So in the physical appearance, Greek talisman were very small, and they were often carved on stone, sometimes other materials like bone and also wood, sometimes also papyrus, and they were inscribed with specific symbols and figures, often related to religion or gods and goddesses, and they were sort of kept close or worn around. Phylacteries are similar. In that time, in Greek phylacteries, they were small boxes or pouches containing scrolls or poison or specific mixtures that were thought of to protect. So those were small boxes or pouches, and they were worn close to the body for protection, and a lot made from similar materials like wood, bone, stone, papyrus, and metal. And these materials and these specific objects, even though the belief of an object having magical powers obviously went out of belief, especially after the Enlightenment scientific revolution in today's world, majority of people don't really believe in that. They are still very modern adaptations of talisman phylacteries that still exist, still have beliefs, and people still believe in them. One notable example, the evil eye, which is this picture here. And I've seen it before on specific posters just as a symbol. And a lot of places in Greek or South Italy, this is still very popular talisman or phylactery that people tend to wear around the neck for either like warding off evil or for like good luck. So spells and incantations were also seen in Greek magical papyri, and papyri is like specific ways of noting down incantations and spells. And spells and incantations were used at some point in Greek magical practices, especially in the 4th and 3rd century BCE. There are a lot of similar spells that are very similar in nature, in effect, and in practice as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian practices that I talked about before. It shows just how humans go about making these things and how it's such a universal experience, and also how magical practices travel over time and how similar they can be even throughout civilizations and throughout time periods. Moving on, I'd like to talk about magical practices in the Middle Ages, specifically magic in the early Middle Ages, and also how it sort of slowly started dying down, especially with the rise of Christianity and Christianity's effect on magic. So, as with a lot of different time periods that I've talked about, Magic was broad in this time. It encompassed a wide range of activities that included mystical rituals, things that we would actually consider magic, interactions with supernatural forces, and also today what we might call herbal medicine or just natural remedies, like mashing up minerals and like herbs. That was also considered magic, though we wouldn't today in the 21st century call that. So yeah, it was broad, and it doesn't exactly line up with the definitions from every other civilizations, and it included a lot of what we might categorize as medicine. And there are a lot of different opinions, even in that time, of as what counted as magic, especially with the rise of Christianity and like more fixed religion. There was a lot of maybe debate and different opinions about what was folk practice, what was just okay to do at a home level, at a personal level, like home divination, home charms, versus something that went against the intervention, the divine intervention of God, and went above what a human should be able to do. And because of how broad magic was in that time and how widespread those rituals were, practitioners of magic and varied forms of magic, they came in all different social statuses, showing how broad and how widespread magic as a practice really was. And a lot of people that practice magic were mostly monks and priests in a religious context, physicians and surgeons who worked with like ailments and tried to use magic to heal people, and also like midwives. And though magic in the early days of the medieval period was thought of relatively well, with the rise of Christianity, that slowly started to change. The Latin term magia, which, as I mentioned before, was thought of as like really high, noble, educated people that were experts of astrology, mathematics, and other magical practices, transformed, and the activities were more perceived as unchristian, pagan, or demonic. And this also sort of led to of Christians frequently accusing followers of other religions of evil magic, like Jews and Muslims, and that often led to like very violent conflicts. And despite condemnations from the church in like the mid-medieval era, magical practices, especially folk magic that was available for everyone, still went on. And a lot of times it was integrated into the practice of spirituality and physical healing, and was sort of similar to modern day medicine. And yeah, and in royalty and magic, as talked about before, also had a link. Royalty and magic and figures of political authority, especially the king, were believed to have divine right that included sacred magical powers for healing their subjects. A example of that would be the king's touch, or the divine or the royal touch, as thought of as that time, where a monarch was believed to be able to cure a disease by touching the people that were affected by the disease, as shown in this picture on the right. And the king, they were thought of as almost divine, but that's also where there's a bit of like nuance between, even though Christianity is actively condemning magic, why in specific scenarios it's still okay for something like king's touch, which is a magical concept and which they would have considered magical, to still be actively practiced. And throughout medieval magic, there were, as with any civilization in any time period where magic is practiced, there were multiple forms of magic, the most common being folk magic, which I talked about before. And this, as I said before, was practiced by locals. So it was practiced to get rid of everyday problems. And in Old English Leech Book, Bald's Leech Book as it was called, there were many charms that were easy to understand for a lot of people, especially uneducated people, to just help with their life in very simple problems. Didn't really require priests, like higher levels of magic, or the ones we talked about in previous units. And few examples of this, like there would have been a charm for delayed birth, and that actually included some that was similar to like stepping over a grave and reciting specific phrases, and that's an example of just charm related magic, something that we would consider maybe superstition or magic today. But there was also things like making a drink from trace prayer, wash paper, herbs, and wine, which was suited for protection, which we would think of maybe as like natural ailments or something that could be made as like a drink, but we wouldn't really think of it as magical arts beyond the explanation sciences they would have at the time. So, and another one would have been like charms to help farmers find lost cattle, and another being hare's foot, like the foot of a hare, which is still used in a lot of different cultures today. People still carry around hare foots for luck and for superstition. It was kept in the pocket for safe travel. Another being the rosemary in pocket for keeping evil away. Here on the right, there's a page from Ball's Leech book, so this is where a lot of the spells and incantations for these everyday problems practiced by locals would have been coming from. This is written in Old English, by the way. And even though folk magic was the most widespread, there was also a lot of different magic that rose from that. One notable example being ritual magic, which was mostly performed by clerics and educated people. So those are people with a bit more magical expertise than just locals. And it involved more complex texts called grimoires, which is pictured on the right. And they were often magical books filled with complex spells, instructions, and calculations that you would have had to have a fair amount of like religious or just magical knowledge to really interpret. And it wouldn't be something that the general public would use, such as the folk magic or things in the Leech book. Because of how important and how complex these spells and practices were, it was considered a very dangerous yet powerful form of magic. Another one, very small subsection magic, would be astrology, which was widely practiced at the time, sort of interpreting the stars, interpreting the night sky, another form of interpreting and trying to influence the natural world. And that was often regarded at the time, and even by medieval scholars today, as a form of science, also sort of a beginning pre-astronomy, which is more grounded in science, whereas astrology is more horoscope related and more like really magic related. Another would have been divination, as I talked about before, various methods to tell the future or discover hidden knowledge that was done through like tarot, crystal ball readings, palm readings. There were various methods used, and those often stemmed from astrology and folk magic. It was sort of, divination was something practiced by a lot of people, a lot of just regular people, and a lot of practices from astrology and folk magic also helped with divination. Again, charms, which are objects, like I said before, amulets and talisman, phylacteries, and these special like objects held, like the hare's foot or rosemary, objects used for protection or healing. And last would be herbology, which are medical practices that relied heavily on plants, animals, and minerals, especially used for like healing or ailments or giving the drinker some type of special advantage, similar to like a magical potion. But we wouldn't really consider that magic today. Again, it's just like natural substances being grinded up. And herbology was also sometimes combined with charms. All these magical practices were thought of as on the same level and sort of one and the same, different fields in this huge field of magic, and they were sort of thought of at the same level and different sort of sides of magic, so that's why they were sort of used in combination so much. The last form of magic, which would have been something that would have come to the attention, and that's why magic sort of has a negative connotation today, especially in Western European societies, is sorcery, and especially when that word was used, it meant evil sorcery or witchcraft. And this is different from white magic, or the magic I talked about before, which was used to help, to heal, or to protect or defend. It was very clearly used to cause harm, misfortune, or death to others. It was also very much linked with Satan or the devil. People that were thought of to practice sorcery were also thought of as making pacts with the devil, and this was one of the main targets of theological and legal condemnation, especially in a lot of religious texts that were talking about how magic was an abomination or magic was a sin. So, because of that, as Christianity solidified its stance and sort of the evil magic sort of became more widely known, the Christianity solidified its stance and became more rigid, and even magical practices that were folk magic, like divination, omens, and charms, that were used before by locals and by regular people, that weren't really used in a negative way, were still forbidden in Mosaic law as Christianity solidified itself. That's the Old Testament. And it was also condemned in the Bible. There are specific religious quotes from the Bible that talk about magic, and this is where magic sort of slowly started to have this negative, not slowly, but it has started to have this negative connotation, especially in Western societies. So Deuteronomy 18, chapter 18, 10, 12, is one or who casts spells, consulting ghosts and spirits, or seeks oracles from the dead. Anyone who does such thing is an abomination to the Lord. And many other religious texts cited similar practices, consulting ghosts, casting spells, things that would have been under this realm of like evil sorcery, not at all related to the white magic of like divination, charms that were used as folk magic in the time, but still all forms of magic were sort of looked down upon. Another quote, Exodus chapter 22, 18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So yeah, again, another example of how Christianity sort of turned on all forms of witchcraft, regardless of if it was helping white magic or if it was evil sorcery, and witchcraft sort of and magic sort of had this evil connotation that sort of came from it. And so when Christianity was first starting, or like early Christian views, or Pauline Christianity, there were a lot of negative views of sorcery even in that time. The Apostle Paul, Apostle to the Galatians, noted that sorcery was, quote, work of the flesh. There's also a lot of disapproval of sorcery that's shown in the Dutch, which is a mid-late first century church discipline book, though these practices and these texts weren't widely known until around like the 13th and 14th century, when like witchcraft and witch hunts really started taking off. People still practiced magic before that, but in the 13th and 14th century is when all magic started to be looked down upon. It was thought of as like going against the power of God, as cited by a lot of different texts, and even to the point where like Council Paderborn and a lot of different laws outlawed belief in witches and just tried to eradicate that from the system of beliefs and eradicate that from the civilizations. And in a lot of other places, witchcraft began to die out and began to see as heresy, and a lot of people tried to force it out of the public and stop people from performing things even remotely close to witchcraft. And those that still practice witchcraft, regardless of which form, even something as normal as like making a herbal mixture or something along the lines of folk magic, they were still targeted. Belief in witchcraft, because of those people that were increasingly getting targeted and executed and put on trial, became more popular, and witches were seen to be allied with the devil. And this is where witchcraft as a negative thing really took off, and more people began to think of witchcraft as something negative. And this eventually leads to infamous witch hunts across Europe, especially in northwest Europe, in the 13th and 14th century among early Protestant people. And this led to tens of thousands of executions for witchcraft. And that's also, where witch hunts, even in America and other parts of the world, really started. And as I was saying, because of that, a significant shift occurred in the 14th century. As Christian theology evolved and became stricter, these people that were practicing these things like folk magic, people started recognizing that not as just what it was, but rebellion against God and humanity, as it was sort of messing with things beyond the science of that time, and by that means was something that humans should not be able to do. And these people that were practicing these things were often considered by these people, especially Europeans, as evil or sinful or even in a pact with the devil, because of how unnatural or unorthodox they thought it was that they could harness the power that went above what humans could be able to do into godly territory. And because of that, they assumed that it was that it was sinful, that it was associated with the devil. And that's where witch trials really came up, from this desire to just get rid of every person that had this ability, because it went against everything that they had known, and went against their religion and what they think human and God should have and the roles that they should have. And the hunt sort of just became a tool to catch all prosecutions and almost to purge communities of just undesirable social outcasts, to the point where it wasn't even people actually practicing magic. It was just specific people that went away from social norms, didn't follow social expectations. And this rise and different view on witchcraft, primarily caused by Christianity, had such a profound impact on how magic, something that's been going on practice for so many centuries, had been understood and practiced. And even within that, despite the extreme condemnations of black magics and just magic in general in Europe, that was considered anti-Christian or pagan or devil supporting. Even within that context, a lot of Europeans adapted certain practices that could be considered magical within religious context, and that could be holy relics and blessed objects. And they perform they do practices that could in the Western eye be considered magic, but are in a religious context, so are socially acceptable. And this just goes to show such the shifting definition of magic, how much it can change depending on social context, and how different it's been looked at throughout history, and how something in one period can have an impact on something that's been practiced as a strong practice across tens of centuries and many centuries. And even after that, even after the witch hunts, as the Age of Enlightenment, the scientific revolution started coming up, belief in witches and magic obviously went down as scientific practice began to emerge, because the need for magic, which was to bridge this unexplainable gap that was caused by lack of scientific knowledge, was bridged, because now there's something like magic that can bridge this gap in knowledge, but can also be justified with repeatable observation, meaning it's more legitimate. So everything sort of started to die down. But also, as Christianity began to spread to Africa and Asia, even though in Europe and the Western world, people started to deny witchcraft and magic started to die down, the practices started to die down, and witchcraft started to die down, a lot of communities and civilizations in Africa and Asia, where Christianity was being spread, had strong pre-modern beliefs in witchcraft similar to the ones it would have had like centuries ago. And because of this, a lot of African independent churches developed responses to witchcraft and the negative aspects of witchcraft and sort of the condemnation of witchcraft, and that led to the rise of new religious movements like Wicca, viewing witches and witchcraft as a religion that's as legitimate as others, just not believing in Satan. And it's really surprising and interesting how witchcraft can transform into this thing over centuries, over time periods, over civilizations, can go from this really small set of practices to something that can be thought of as a religion, a mindset, and can be something used as a hobby, can be something for entertainment, pop culture. The evolution of this word in historical context and the evolution of the practices that go along with it have been so drastically different over time, and it's really surprising how historical context and social context can do to a concept like magic, even after being established for hundreds of years. Yet today, even though a lot of witchcraft has been disproven and a lot of people don't believe in witchcraft anymore, there are still beliefs in witchcraft that are negative, especially from very fundamentalist Christians that see witchcraft in any form as negative or dangerous. And a few examples of that would be series like Harry Potter or The Chronicles of Narnia or Lord of the Rings. And yes, witchcraft has evolved. No one is practicing witchcraft the way they did in the historical examples I was talking about. All witchcraft today is either done in the form of maybe a hobby or it's in pop culture and literature or film. No one is actively trying to cause harm to anyone with magic, and witchcraft and magic has a very different definition as it did centuries ago. Even taking that into account, and the fact that early superstitions that have been completely disproven, a lot of pop culture magic and magic still today has faced these challenges. The Harry Potter series in particular has faced challenges over decades, especially the most notable case in the early 2000s, the Southern Baptist Convention urged parents to keep their children away from such books. So, as we can see, even though magic has evolved in such a incredible, drastic way, there are still some pre-modern beliefs that influence what magic is today, and it will continue to stay around influencing this word, making sure that it's not really going to go away. Even after so many scientific and advancements, magic's still going to stay with all of us. So, in conclusion, magic is diverse. It means a lot of different things. It can mean herbology, it can mean mixing up different herbs, and it can mean so many different things across different time periods and different civilizations. As we've seen, it can be used in a very negative context. It can also be used in a positive context, and it has so many different definitions and so many different practices that come from it, but they all come from this core idea that is born from the idea of like humans need a way to explain the unexplainable. We've always needed a way to explain the unexplainable. Today, that can be easily done with scientific observation, but in the ancient period, it was done through magic. It was done through creating these stories, creating these rituals and incantations, and telling everyone that this would bridge that gap, which would explain the unexplainable and let them influence the unexplainable, helping it grow. To funerary spells of ancient Egyptians, the earliest forms of Mesopotamian Ashipu priests to combat demons, to even the blend of folk and ritual magic in Europe. Magic is a study of humanity's fears, beliefs, desires, and choices. Across every civilization, magic has been consistent through its forms, and social acceptance has varied dramatically. It's adapted to different cultural contexts really quickly, absorbed influences from other societies, from other fields, and demonstrated humanity's efforts to understand and interact with unseen forces, and just how much of an impact that can have on the human existence and the world as a whole. Magic is a study of humanity's fears, beliefs, desires, and choices. Thank you for listening.